In moments of great uncertainty, when the day slowly faded into darkness, Abram stood alone, his gaze fixed on the sky, feeling the words that God spoke to him. He was a man of faith, though the world around him was filled with hard questions and challenges. Abram couldn't see the whole picture, but his faith was his guide. "Look," God said, "I am leading you to a place that will be your covenant. Your descendants will inherit it, and it will become a land for many nations." In that moment, God's promise was like a light breaking through the surrounding darkness. But God's promise wasn't simple. Abram was aware that the path to the fulfillment of this divine blessing would not be easy. God revealed to Abram that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land, that they would endure suffering, but that they would be delivered. They would return with great wealth, and God would free them in his time. "You, Abram, will die in peace and be buried in a good old age, but your descendants will face suffering in a foreign land. But don't forget, they will return, and they will inherit the land that I am giving to you," the Lord said. These words were not just instructions, but also confirmation of God's covenant with Abram. God promised him a land that would belong to his descendants, from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. A land that would be filled with nations, but a land that would ultimately belong to Abram's descendants. God confirmed his covenant with signs that went beyond the ordinary world. When the sun set and darkness fell, two signs appeared: a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between the pieces of the sacrifice. These signs revealed two things. First, that there would be suffering, as in the bondage of Israel in Egypt, but at the same time, there would be light, deliverance, just as the lamp burned brightly, showing God's help. And something amazing happened, Abram recalled. Two mighty forces passed between the pieces of the sacrifice, a sign that God is confirming his covenant with me and my descendants. This wasn't just a regular ritual. It was a sign of God's faithfulness and mercy. Each of these images was important to Abram. God was there, even though he couldn't see him. His promise was like a light breaking through the darkness, giving him certainty and peace. God told him that what he promised would surely come to pass, no matter the difficulties his descendants would face. The promise was secure, and even the land that would belong to them would bring both joy and suffering. Though he couldn't see the whole picture, Abram was sure of one thing: God was faithful to his promises. Just as the smoking furnace and burning lamp passed between the pieces of the sacrifice, God would guide his descendants, even through the darkest times of life. God's covenant light was unstoppable, and this was something Abram felt deeply in his heart. He was certain that God would bring all of these promises to fruition, because what God had spoken would surely happen. Just as the land would ultimately belong to his descendants, so too would God's light guide them, even when the world around them seemed full of challenges. This was the beginning of Abram and his descendants' journey, a journey that would take them through suffering and trials, but also through God's light that would guide them to their destination. This covenant was not just for Abram, but for all who descend from him. This story of God's covenant will live on today, in the hearts of every believer. God does not abandon his people, and just as he guided Abram through the darkness, so he will guide us. The light that never stops burning shows the path of faith and hope. Hagar was a servant of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, whom God had chosen to be the father of a great nation. Despite God's promise to Abraham, Sarah was barren and could not bear children. In her desperation and desire to fulfill God's plan, Sarah made a decision that would forever change the course of Hagar's life. She gave her servant, Hagar, to Abraham to conceive a child. This was not an unusual practice in those times, but it marked the beginning of a complex and painful journey for Hagar. She became pregnant, and with it, the tension between her and Sarah grew. As Hagar's pregnancy progressed, her relationship with Sarah deteriorated. The bitterness and jealousy that Sarah felt turned into harsh treatment toward Hagar. What was once an act of obedience to her mistress became a source of oppression for Hagar. The young servant was left to navigate a tumultuous situation in which her worth and dignity were being disregarded. And when her situation became unbearable, when the harshness of her mistress grew too intense, Hagar fled. She ran into the wilderness, the vast, unforgiving desert. There, she hoped to escape the pain and the overwhelming sense of abandonment. The angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar by a spring in the desert. The angel, speaking on behalf of God, asked her a simple but profound question. "Hagar, Sarah's maid, where are you going?" In her brokenness, Hagar replied with a heart full of sorrow, "I am fleeing from the face of my mistress Sarah." It was not just a physical escape she was seeking, but an escape from the emotional torment and uncertainty that plagued her. But the angel did not come to condemn her or scold her for running away. Instead, the angel brought words of comfort and guidance. The message was clear. Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her. Though the command was difficult to hear, it came with a promise that would shape Hagar's future in ways she could not yet understand. The angel continued, "You will have a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction." In those words, God affirmed his deep awareness of Hagar's suffering and his commitment to provide for her and her child. This promise was not just a distant hope, but a direct assurance from God that Hagar was seen, that her pain was not ignored, and that God's hand was upon her. It was a promise that, though she was a servant and an outcast in the eyes of the world, she was precious in the sight of God. Her life had meaning, her struggle was seen, and her future was secured in God's plan. Hagar, filled with awe and gratitude, responded to God's mercy with a newfound understanding. She named the place where she encountered the angel Bir Lahai Roi, meaning the well of him who lives and sees me. This name was a declaration of God's presence and care, a statement that though she was alone and abandoned by the world, God had seen her in her distress and had not left her. She had witnessed a living God, a God who did not turn away from the broken, the neglected, and the rejected. In this desert, Hagar had found a well of living water, not only physical but spiritual, a source of life for her soul. The name she gave to the well became a memorial, not only to her encounter with the divine, but also to the ongoing care and attention God would provide to her and her son. The well represented God's faithfulness to a woman who was otherwise invisible to society. In a world where Hagar's suffering seemed to go unnoticed, God showed up, reaffirmed his promises, and reminded her that she was never truly alone. Hagar returned to Sarah, though the circumstances remained difficult. But now, she carried with her the knowledge that God had not abandoned her. God had spoken, and Hagar had heard. She had encountered God in her pain, and she carried with her the living memory of that encounter. She was now empowered to face the challenges that lay ahead because she knew that God was with her. When Hagar gave birth to her son, she named him Ishmael, meaning God hears. The name Ishmael symbolized not just her son, but the powerful truth that God hears the cries of those who are suffering, those who are forgotten, and those who are cast aside. Ishmael was a living reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, God listens to our pleas, and he responds with mercy and grace. Du tuca prima vo elevon labs. Hagar's story is one of profound significance for anyone who feels isolated, abandoned, or rejected. It is a story of God's intimate involvement in our lives, particularly when we are in the wilderness, both literally and figuratively. God is not distant or uninvolved in our struggles. He sees us in our most difficult moments, and he reaches out to offer comfort, direction, and hope. In Hagar's life, we see a God who does not merely overlook the marginalized or oppressed. We see a God who knows our name, who sees our suffering, and who responds with care and mercy. We are not forgotten, even when we feel invisible to the world. When we are lost in the wilderness, God is there, offering us his promises of restoration and hope. The story serves as a reminder that God's love does not depend on our status or position in life. Whether we are powerful or powerless, known or unknown, God sees us. When we find ourselves in the wilderness of life, whether from personal struggles, pain, or isolation, we can remember that the same God who saw Hagar sees us. His presence is not confined to perfect situations or ideal circumstances, but is present with us in the most broken and difficult moments. He is the God who lives, who sees, and who hears. Hagar's encounter with God in the desert is a testimony to God's unchanging faithfulness. When we feel forsaken or forgotten, we can be assured that God sees, hears, and knows our hearts. His promises to us are as sure and steadfast as they were to Hagar. May we, like Hagar, be reminded of the well of living water that God offers us in our darkest times, and may we hold on to the truth that we are never truly alone. God's eyes are always upon us, and His love never fails.